Hello everyone, this is Rick and welcome to Astral Club. Today we're going to discuss how can our life purpose become corrupted. Before I get into that real quick, I just want to mention that there is the possibility to support Astral Club on Patreon. Those who join Patreon get their videos early on Sunday, and of course we can also communicate back and forth easily using the Patreon email. If interested, there is a link in the description. If you're interested in a private lesson to learn astral projection, or if you just like to increase your own control and number and quality of astral experiences, I'd be glad to work with you. You'll find an email where you can get more information also in the description. The idea for this episode came from Sullivan Clark. I'm going to have to start putting him on a payroll or something because he gave me the idea for another episode recently. His question was, does someone choose the life of a mass shooter, or do they deviate from their soul's destiny? This is certainly a very timely question, and it's something that I asked many years ago from my guide, my angel, to try to understand that very question. And I'd like to offer 3 examples, which I hope will help everyone to understand my thoughts on this particular subject based on what I was told in answer to my questions. And I'd like to use these 3 individuals. Number 1, the guy with the small mustache that used to head up Germany, whose name I can't mention. Jim Jones, whose name I can mention, who was a cult leader in the United States, who ended up moving his cult to Guyana, where they all committed suicide. And Anakin Skywalker. Yes, he is a fictional character in the Star Wars franchise. But I think his particular hero's journey, especially with its side paths that he ended up taking, can be very illustrative of what can happen in the real world to people who come to this planet with a particular purpose in mind. Souls come to Earth with life purposes that can vary. However, no one comes to Earth with the ambition to murder a lot of people. No one does. However, people have free will. We all have goals. However, unfortunately, many times we find that somehow we miss our goals, or we stop striving for them, or we get put off on another off-ramp somewhere. We get diverted from where we should be going, and we end up going in a different direction because of other factors, outside factors that acted upon us and pushed us off the path that perhaps we had set for ourselves before we came into this life. Unfortunately, this happens quite often. Sometimes they allow their purpose to become perverted by hatred of themselves or others, as well as a craving for power and control. Of course, there are many reasons why someone leaves their path for this life for another one. But I think you'll find that in one form or another, you could probably trace it down to some desire for power and control, even if it's just power and control over their own lives. And this legitimate desire goes too far and pushes someone off a preferred path. Let's start with the German dictator, whose name we all know, with the small mustache. He was born in April 20th, 1889 in Braunau, Austria, on the Danube River. He moved to Vienna in 1908 to become an artist. Once in Vienna, though, he showed little interest in developing his skills or even obtaining gainful employment. He'd walk through the city, sometimes with his friend, and go to operas and just take in the sights of this very, very impressive metropolitan milieu, which was Vienna in the pre-WW1 time period in the early 20th century. He'd then stay up late discussing ideas from social reform to city planning. He'd be quick to start a new project, but then he'd abandon it out of laziness or disinterest, or he'd be lured off into the next shiny thing. In October of 1908, he was turned down for the second time for admission to the prestigious Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. His drawings were unimpressive. Now, his buildings, though, were technically correct, but his work lacked life. And it was commented on by the judges that perhaps he should pursue a career in architecture. To say that this individual did not take this advice positively is an understatement. For the next number of years, he was very poor, living hand to mouth. He occupied a residence for poor men at one point and just really drifted. He'd sell some of his paintings for just enough money to buy food and sometimes lodging. He later said of this period that he grew hard, and he owed his experiences from that period to the fact that he was still capable of being hard, which is perhaps the world's greatest understatement. And he made that particular quote in his infamous book, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle in English. In May of 1913, he moved to Munich, Germany to escape being drafted into the Austrian army. Despite the fact that he was an Austrian by birth, he considered himself a true German. And he had no interest in joining the multilingual Austrian army that had a very large group of ethnicities, and he did not see another understatement. He did not see the benefit of that diversity, to say the extremely very least. He ended up moving to, as I said, Munich, Germany in 1913, and he ended up enlisting in a Bavarian regiment when World War I started in 1914. He then experienced 4 bloody years in the trenches as a message deliverer. And if you think that was an easy job, it wasn't. It meant he had to grab a message from the front and then run it to the rear and deliver it, and then return with the answer of the command staff, which meant a lot of running around and having the opposite side, the Allies, taking pot shots at him. So it was by no means an easy job. But after these 4 awful years, he ended up being gassed towards the end of the war, and he got the news that Germany had surrendered while he was in hospital undergoing treatment for this gas attack. There he suffered blindness. Some folks have indicated that it was of a hysterical nature. in that when he heard Germany had surrendered, it affected him so deeply because of his investment in his Germanness and his German pride and his nationalism that he became blind from an extreme psychological problem. Others just said it was a result of the gas attack. I don't know. At any rate, he was deeply affected. Once the war was over, he ended up serving as a kind of a minor spy for the German army. There was a lot of groups cropping up after the war. There was a lot of very angry people who felt aggrieved, and he was to report on these extreme factions to the command staff. One night he attended a rally for a particular group whose name I also can't mention, but let's call it the German Workers' Party. Later on, it would become a shortcut, but I don't want to talk about that either. At any rate, then of course he went on to this particular path, which led eventually to his taking power in 1933, and the rest of that, of course, is known to history. World War One, World War Two, of course, kicks in, and in 1945 he ends up dying by his own hand, suicide with his wife Eva Braun. So what was his original purpose? And this was of very much interest to me because of my interest in World War II. So when I asked my angel what was the deal with this individual, he told me that his original life goal was to experience love and life and spread beauty in the world. Believe it or not, that was his purpose. And his art was going to be his primary vehicle to do this. Unfortunately, he allowed a number of things, including a defect in his character, that he was lazy. He was so lazy that despite the fact that he had this natural artistic talent, he failed to develop it. Many people think that great artists are born. Well, perhaps the germ of great artists are born. But in order to become a great artist, or a great anything, you got to put in 10,000 or more hours in a lot of work to truly become a master at your craft. This was something that he failed to do, as I said, out of pure laziness. So when he was rejected by the Vienna Academy of Arts, he became very angry and gave up, became apathetic, and just wandered about looking for some sort of mission, some sort of guidance, because he was now off his path and he was unable or unwilling to do the work necessary to get back onto his life path. And of course, we all know the result of this tragic deviation from his life path. It plunged the world into misery and death that claimed the lives of millions and millions of people. So the penalty for this failure in this one individual's life purpose caused quite the catastrophe for the world. Next up is Jim Jones. Now, Jim Jones, slightly less famous than the first person I talked about, but at least I can mention his name. He was born in May of 1931 in Crete, Indiana. He ended up dying in November 1978 in Jonestown, Guyana. As a child, he had a deep affinity for Pentecostalism with a desire to preach. He established the infamous People's Temple in Indianapolis in 1955. He founded this temple as a fully integrated congregation promoting Christian socialism. Now let's pause for a second there. Indianapolis in 1955 might as well have been the South. Indeed, the whole idea of blacks and whites attending the same church was a blasphemy in the eyes of many people of that time. It was unheard of. It was unthinkable. Segregation was very much not only the law of the land, but it was also the custom of the land. Unfortunately, even to this day, many churches are, if not segregated by law, they're segregated by custom. And but certainly back then, it was unheard of. And so he was certainly on the leading edge of a civil rights type mindset for that time. And he was very much engaged in the civil rights struggle in that early time. In 1965, Jones moved the temple to California with the HQ in San Francisco. At its height, the temple had 3,000 members who all lived communally. What they would do is, if you had Social Security checks or if you worked, you would just have all that money sent to the community. And then everyone just lived, communally on Jim Jones's temple property. Now, after some bad publicity about church abuses, Jones moved the church to Guyana, and in 1974 to build his socialist paradise. In November 1978, he ordered a mass murder-suicide after a congressman arrived to do an inspection, and the congressman ended up being killed by the cult members, and Jones announced a white night, which was his code word for mass suicide. They all were forced, either willingly or unwillingly, to drink Flavor Aid laced with poison. It wasn't Kool-Aid, it was Flavor Aid. Poor Kool-Aid. I mean, they say any publicity is good publicity. I wouldn't go that far, not in this particular case. But at any rate, they used a generic product with poison in it. And in a very serious note, 909 members died there in the jungle in Guyana, 304 of which were children. So obviously, Jones's life lesson went dramatically off course. He came to this lifetime in a poor family. He endured suffering and privation, but his life mission was to help those who were downtrodden, to bring unity to a divided humanity. And religion was going to play a very major part in achieving that goal. And he made progress early on towards that goal. But somewhere along the line, he sensed the power that came with the leadership of this church. He was treated more and more as a prophet, and perhaps later on as a god. And it corrupted him. He veered off his life purpose. He began to use martial punishments. He began to take advantage of his cult members sexually. There was a wide variety of other abuses, which I can't get into here because this isn't about him per se. However, this lust for power, lust for lots of other things, along with the fear of losing control, he was always fleeing from place to place. He would flee, where he grew up to Indianapolis, and then from there he'd flee to San Francisco, and then eventually into northern a northern city in California. And then lastly, he'd flee all the way to Guyana because he feared losing control. He feared the government taking control from him, taking his power away. So eventually he fled to that dark, dark place in Guyana. And of course, what made it worse was he then became addicted to a wide variety of drugs. And this only further weakened, deformed his soul to a point where he got about as far away as he could from his original life's mission. Instead of trying to save these poor and unfortunate people, he ended up killing them, which is about as far away from saving them as you can possibly get. Next, I want to discuss Anakin Skywalker. Now, of course, Anakin Skywalker is a fictional character in the Star Wars universe. And everything I say here is based on the original trilogy and the prequels. I will not discuss those movies by that company, which shall not be named, that begins with a D for dark side. So Anakin Skywalker was born a slave on his home planet of Tatooine. He was prophesized to bring balance to the Force. He was rescued by Qui-Gon Jinn at age 9, and he was separated from his mother to become a Jedi. He went through a lot of adventures, but eventually these adventures led him to betray the Jedi. And we'll get into his motives in a second. But he ended up in the infamous fight on the planet Mustafar. And he fought with Obi-Wan Kenobi, who ended up becoming his master and his friend. And in a very crucial scene, when the fight ended and Obi-Wan had the high ground, and Anakin decided to challenge him anyway, and Obi-Wan cut him down. The words that Obi-Wan said after that were very central to the overall plot of this character. He said, Anakin, you were the chosen one. It was said you'd destroy the Sith, not join them. The Sith were the evil ones. That you'd bring balance to the Force, not leave it in darkness. You were my brother, Anakin. I loved you. Anakin Skywalker, in this particular legend, had a purpose. Now, being born a slave, he was certainly afflicted with a fear. Why? Well, being a slave, you have zero control over your life. At any time, your life can be upended. You can be sold. You can leave your mother, father, what have you, and never see them again. You can be sent anywhere, asked to do anything, commanded to do anything. You have zero control over your own life. So, is it really surprising that a slave should be fearful? That's not something I'm going to judge anyone who's a slave because they felt fear. Fear is something I would imagine is a natural emotion when you're placed in that particular position. But Anakin allowed his fear to turn to anger and then eventually to hate, which of course led to suffering. And that is a more or less quote from Master Yoda himself. So this fear, which led to the anger and then the hatred, perverted his life course. He resented the Jedi Council for their slowness, for their perceived corruption, for their inability to acknowledge the extent of his talents and powers. And he allowed his love for Padme Amidala, who was a queen of Naboo, and later on a senator of Naboo. Anyway, he fell in love with her, and he allowed this love to turn to fear of loss, to possessiveness, and jealousy. And let's face it, before we judge, how many of us have fallen into that trap? Perhaps when we were a lot younger and we had this love, but something happened and it turned inside of us to a thing that was once beautiful, but then slowly turned to ugliness. So let's not judge him too harshly on that particular note, because that'll end up judging many of us, at least when we were younger. He then went looking for a shortcut. And shortcuts can be very beneficial, but they can also cost one, because sometimes you have to do the hard work in order to truly achieve something. And if you try to shortcut it, in many cases, you can lead to a position where you haven't earned a particular state because you haven't done what's necessary. You haven't built the blocks one atop another to truly appreciate, to truly achieve a position. A shortcut says, and it whispers seductively in your ear, you don't need to do all that work. All you have to do is just take this shortcut and everything will be yours. Power, wealth, love, you name it. And he allowed himself to be seduced by Darth Sidious, who was a Sith Lord and the epitome of the dark side. And of course, in the dark side is a desire for what? Control, power. And if you're dealing with someone who still inside was a slave, that slave who felt that fear, who felt the inability to have any control over his life, over his mother's life, and it allowed his character to become twisted. And this individual, who would become the emperor, used those weaknesses in him and turned his noble instincts into about the basest evil that is available to one. And in the Star Wars universe, that is translated into immersing oneself into the dark side. Now, the dark side can offer much power, but that power comes at a cost. It comes at a price. Because whenever you want to assert control like that, that means you have to not only control yourself, but to control others. And as soon as you start to forcibly control others, you are now trespassing on their free will. And especially if your motives are selfish or dark, then you will be judged harshly. On a positive note, at the very end of his life, he realized his error as Darth Vader. He realized where he went wrong when he heard his son, Luke Skywalker, heard the words that he said, felt the pain as his son was being tortured by the Emperor because his son refused to make the same mistake, the same grab for power that his father had. That's what turned him. That's what caused him to return to his life purpose, which was to achieve balance, to return balance to the Force. And he picked up the old Emperor and chucked him down that big, long hole or tube, and ending his life and his dark reign over the galaxy far, far away. So that's this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I'd like to know what you think your life purpose is and how you think you're doing. Please leave that in the comment section along with any observations or questions you have about life purposes in this world. If you like this, please hit the like button, share it with those of like minds, subscribe if you haven't already, and many of you have. 3/4 of the people listening to this have subscribed, which is amazing. Thank you. If you have subscribed, make sure you get notification by making sure that bell is on. And as always, I'm Rick, and I'll see you on the astral plane.